And now it's my pleasure to introduce our presenter, Nancy Frey. Nancy Frey is Professor of Educational Leadership at San Diego State University and a leader at Health Sciences High and Middle College. Previously, Nancy was a teacher, an academic coach, and Central Office Resource Coordinator in Florida. She's a credentialed special educator, reading specialist, and administrator in California. She's a member of the International Literacy Association's Literacy Research Panel. She's published widely on literacy, quality instruction, and assessment, as well as books such as The Artificial Intelligence Playbook, now in its second edition, How Scaffolding Works, How Teams Work, The Vocabulary Playbook, and the Teacher Clarity Playbook, and Rigor Unveiled. Thank you, Nancy, for being with us today. And with that, I will hand the mic over to you.
Thank you so much, Megan. And I have to say, for all of you, I am truly dazzled by not only representation all around the country, all around the world as well, but also too, we understand that it is early June, and the commitment and the interest that you show in making sure that things are done well with educators and for educators is really something that all of us are so grateful for. And that was the whole idea behind professional learning communities. These were actually conceived nearly 50 years ago. So going back to the late 1960s and early 1970s, because, and I know this was a really long time ago, but boys and girls, that didn't used to be professional learning that was happening in schools. That was a real rarity. And there were researchers and policymakers who recognized that teachers deserve to be able to have ongoing professional learning in their own lives. And so at that time, professional learning communities were conceived as a way for teachers to be able to gather together, to be able to learn with and from one another. That was the whole idea behind them. The L in PLCs was the major important part of this. And professional learning communities, of course, predate things like the development of standards and those sorts of things, as well as lots of other professional learning opportunities as well. But they continue to matter and they continue to resonate. Certainly, what we have learned over these several decades is how very important it is that what it is that teachers know and the relationships that adults have with one another, that relational trust, is absolutely critical to be able to advance the learning of students. And I'm going to do a shout out one more time for Elaine Allensworth. Her work on relational trust and how it impacts the learning of students is phenomenal. Now, here's the trouble with PLCs. The trouble is that there actually hasn't been a lot of formal ongoing development of what professional learning communities are. And so what happens, and I'm kind of reminded of that game that many of us played when we were kids, you know, when you'd sit in a circle and the first person would whisper a message into the ear of the person sitting next to them, and then it would be whispered all the way around the circle. And by the time the message got back to the first person, it was completely different. Professional learning communities often end up looking that way as well. There's little attention that is given to how it is that adults work together during teacher preparation programs. And I want to be really, really clear about all of that too, because I work in teacher preparation programs. There's a lot of content that we're subscribed to be able to do by the state. And so adult learning, unfortunately, is not a part of those teacher preparation standards. And so here's what happens. A new teacher is fresh out of the university, is hired in their first school, and they look over what the agenda for the week is going to be. And it says something on there about that there's a PLC meeting on Wednesday mornings. And that person, that young person, says to somebody who's an experienced staff member, "What's a PLC?" And that experienced staff member says, "Don't worry, I'll show you." And so they go with whatever the meeting is on that particular day, and that becomes the way that they believe PLCs should function. Now, there are lots of good, really, really good professional learning communities that are out there, but there are also a lot of professional learning communities that have kind of gone sideways, much like the whisper game, where the message has really degraded along the way. Another item that gets in the way in terms of how it is that professional learning communities should be implemented is a fundamental misunderstanding about what the professional learning community is. The professional learning community is the organization. There are teams that function within that organization, but the professional learning community itself is the organization, whether it is the school organization or the district organization. And so what that means is that there need to be mechanisms for how it is that we feed innovation. There are brilliant things that some teams are able to accomplish, but if there's never an opportunity to be able to share what those innovations are, then we end up with this silo. There are silos of excellence that are in existence, but we don't get to be able to spread innovation. And that really undermines the consistency and the coherence of the school organization itself. And again, massive amounts of research, including Elaine's research. I keep talking about Elaine, including Elaine's research about how very important consistency and coherence are in being able to move school organizations forward. I hope I've articulated an argument that PLCs have to be done right. We have to be able to acknowledge what some of those misconceptions are and then work with intention toward being able to right the ship, to be able to say, hey, here's what a professional learning community actually is and how it functions. So with that, Doug and I have been working now for a number of years, along with other colleagues, around really kind of reconceiving what the next generation of professional learning communities can be and should be, and what they look like. And in fact, I can tell you that at our school in San Diego, we've been utilizing this model of professional learning communities for a number of years now, in order to be able to really test out what are those things that work well. And that model that we've developed includes, and I'll draw your attention first of all to that tree that's right there in the center. That model is really 5 questions that help to drive the investigation cycle. Importantly, in terms of investigation cycles, whoever said that you only are allowed to have one investigation cycle per year annually, right? At the school where I work, our professional learning community cycles are every 9 weeks. In other words, we have 4 cycles a year. There are other schools that we work with that have 3 cycles a year, or 5 or 6 cycles a year. It really depends on what the organization needs. But that investigation cycle starts with the first question, where are we now? The second question, where do we want to go? That third question is how do we move learning forward? That's the instruction question that seems to have been left out of lots of models. That fourth question, what have we as adults learned from one another today? And that fifth question, who benefited and who did not? Now, across those cross-cutting values, include how is it that we hold high expectations? How is it that we ensure that collective efficacy among the adults continues to be built? How is it that we ensure that there is equity and fairness in all of the work that we do? How is it that we make sure that we are continuing to learn from one another? Now, what brackets that model include things like protocols. Those protocols help to be able to kind of set the guardrails for what those conversations look like within teams as well as across the entire professional learning community. And they're associated with actions, with specific actions to be able to take. In other words, it's really important that professional learning communities and the teams that operate within them yield decisions, come to decisions so that they can take action. And the newest part of what we're utilizing is around liberatory design. And if you're unfamiliar with liberatory design, it comes from design thinking. In other words, in being able to envision what are the outcomes that you're looking for, and then be able to design with intention to be able to do so. And so we've infused the liberatory design functions in there as well. Those 5 questions that I noted earlier are not questions that have to be done in a particular order. Well, whereas I noted that where we going is often conceived of as the first one, it isn't always necessarily. We can pair them up in lots of different ways. For example, we can think about within a single time that we're together, where are we now and how are we moving learning forward, that instructional piece, right? We can consider where are we going at the same time that we're also considering who traditionally is benefiting and not benefiting from the work that we're doing. There's a level of flexibility that's within there. Again, it's really about being able to equip educators with decision-making authority to make consequential decisions about what it is that they're doing, what it is that they're learning about. And you're exactly right, Maya. It's meant to be very iterative in that regard. So I've got 4 quick success criteria for our short time together today. What I hope to spark up with all of you is some thinking about strengths. I can focus on strengths around the organization, and in this particular case, student strengths as well. I can teach all of the standards. I can engage in conversations about learning and teaching, and I can use AI as a teaching assistant. And that's one of the newer features that we've brought in. How do you invite AI to the PLC table? So let's start first with a strengths-based approach to what it is that we do. And this certainly dovetails nicely with that question of where are we now? And it can be tempting, quite frankly, when looking at where it is that we are right now, that perhaps we end up engaging in conversation about what it is that students are not able to do. There's also sometimes a misinterpretation with what a strengths-based approach is. A strengths-based approach is not ignoring what the challenges are, only talking about positive things, but rather it's a much more nuanced approach. And I saw that some of our colleagues from Australia are on the line, and this particular model comes from Australia. A strengths-based approach includes 3 factors. What a student can already do, really important to be able to figure that out so that you know where it is that you can accelerate the teaching. That second part of it, what can a student do when provided with educational support, also known as teaching? That's what it is that we do. What will this student be able to do with educational support? And that longer term vision, what will this student one day be able to do? In other words, keeping in mind what should this student be able to do by the end of the school year or by the end of the grade band that we're in? Where are we moving not only immediately, but moving forward? Unfortunately, one of the difficulties, challenges with professional learning community teams is that often they devolve into deficit thinking. There's a really interesting study that was done a couple of years ago that was called How Did That Happen? And yes, I put the zhuzh on that title. Teachers' explanations for low test scores. And what these researchers were interested in doing was analyzing the recorded transcripts of professional learning community teams from all across the country over the course of the year. And what they were interested in looking at specifically is what happened in the conversation whenever data were presented in that professional learning community team. Keep in mind that the data are primarily the data that are teacher generated data. In other words, how was it that students did on a chapter test or a unit test, as well as some of the benchmark or interim assessments that are done. Not only those state or in some cases national tests being done, but lots of different assessments along the way. So I've set up this study, right? What did teachers talk about when data were presented? And what they found were that 85% of the time, there were deficits in those discussions. 33% of the explanations were around student behavior. In other words, well, he didn't do good on this science test that we gave because, he never pays attention. At other times, a mismatch between the assessment demands and the student. Well, he's an English language learner. They never do well on this benchmark. Or talking about the student's home life. They don't read to her at home. Blaming the family. And in other cases, either suspected or established underlying conditions. It was surprising, these researchers found, how often there were conversations that were speculative around dyslexia and other learning disabilities. 85% of the time, when teachers were confronted with data, they moved immediately from what the teaching could be to what were the student characteristics. Only 15% of the time did teachers actually move into the space of being able to figure out what has worked well, who benefited and who did not, what were some of the practices that were successful, how might we address some of those practices again in the future. Now, I want to be really clear about this. These are not uncaring teachers that were involved in this research. But what it does evidence is that it's teachers who have a low sense of collective efficacy. They don't know what to do. And so therefore, in not knowing what to do, the conversation often went sideways and moved into the characteristics of the students. Having a deep sense of what a strengths-based approach is and how it is that we analyze student work in those professional learning communities is essential. And here's where protocols come into play again. Now, I'll show you an example. This is a seventh grader from Canada who is a level 1 multilingual learner. And I'll give you just a moment to kind of gaze on what it is that he's doing. I'll also show you a clearer way of being able to see what it was that he wrote about. And hopefully what you're noticing is that the drawing up there are two kids who are wearing hats, and there are two kids who have a smiley face on their t-shirt. All right, here's what it is that he wrote. Now, in the absence of being able to have some protocols that are in place about how it is that we analyze student work, it would be conceivable that a seventh grade team would kind of throw up their hands and say, well, I don't even know where to start with this student. I don't even know where to begin. But what we can do is we can take that apart. Remember that a strengths-based approach is number one, what is it that the student can already do? And so I've highlighted some things. One of the things that he can already do is that he's got some utility words that are in place, as well as some subject-specific words like basketball and team and score. And Maya, I agree with you as well. Um, he also understands some of the grammar that is already in place. As you know, the grammar and the syntax of every language is different. He already has some knowledge about how grammar in English compared to grammar in his first language, Spanish, what are the differences between the two? He's lining up those words correctly. He's got some of that syntax down, and he's writing not only simple sentences, but he's trying out some compound sentences as well. He's got pronunciation, he's got spelling that is often informed by pronunciation, not surprising at all, but he understands clearly about things like the mechanics, capitalization, using periods, and those sorts of things. And he's begun to do some of that editing along the way. Remember that editing is not something that you only do when you're all finished writing. You pretty much start editing on about the fourth word because you're thinking about what it is that you want to say next. And those self-corrections, as Maya said, are fantastic. All teachers know when we see self-corrections, what that signals is that that student is rereading what they're writing. And as Maya pointed out, he didn't know the English word for hoop, but he knew what it was, and so he drew it. I love that. I love that creativity in being able to do so. This is a student who knows how to solve problems. Now, remember, the second part of a strengths-based approach, not only knowing what it is that they can do, what can they do with educational support? And what the professional learning community team can really do is to figure out what is it that needs to happen next. And so here's an example. This was what a team in analyzing that student work came up with in terms of next steps instruction. Around giving him some more descriptive words and subject-specific words, in terms of developing his knowledge of verbs for present, past, and continuous tenses, and expanding the number of conjunctions that he's using. He's already got some that are in there. Being able to increase the detail in the simple sentences and in sentences with clauses, helping him to be able to have a wider range of familiar words that he can spell from memory using some simple writing frames, and of course, making sure that he has grammar and dictionary notes or a checklist that he has access to. Do you hear the collective efficacy of the team in being able to say, let's take a close look at what he can do, and then let's identify what it is that he needs to learn next. What are the next steps instruction to be able to do? It's empowering for teams to be able to do so. Now let's move into that second success criteria around teaching all of the standards. And yes, I'm emphasizing the word all of the standards. We know that a model of learning is around the three-legged stool, if you will: curriculum, instruction, and assessment. They pair together, and when they are working together well, that's what yields the learning that happens within classrooms. Having that balance of curriculum, instruction, and assessment, they're not separate items, but rather that there's a balance to them, can be really important. And we also know too that if any one of those legs is weak, the stool is going to fall over. If curriculum, for example, is problematic, the stool is going to tip over. If there is great curriculum, but there's not great instruction that's paired with it, it's not going to work. And if assessment is treated as something that we have to do, then we're not able to make decisions about when we can accelerate learning and when it is that we need to do a bit of reteaching along the way. And yeah, Emily, you're talking about another one of my heroes as well. Richard Elmore's work in this field has been amazing and informative to all of us. So let's talk about curriculum. Curriculum certainly deserves to have the kind of attention that should be. It's an important part of that stool. And Richard Posner talked about the different kinds of curriculum in particular, that those included the official curriculum, the operational curriculum, the hidden curriculum, the null curriculum, and the extra curriculum. So let's break that down just a bit. The official curriculum is the written curriculum. This is often coming in the form of standards documents, as well as the high quality instructional materials that have been adopted by a district or by a state. That's the written curriculum that happens. But the operational curriculum, that's actually what is taught by the teacher and how it's communicated. So we're never able to completely close that gap between the official curriculum and the operational curriculum. There's so many variables that are involved there. But the gap, when it gets too wide, really becomes problematic. The hidden curriculum includes what are the norms and the values of the society. They tend to be pretty strong and pretty durable, but there may be conflict among them. For example, how is it that we organize students? That conveys a whole lot of the climate and the culture of the school. Do we have lots of different segregated settings for students with a variety of disabilities that are apart from the general flow of the school that communicates a value without ever intending to? Do we have tracked classes where there are honors classes and there are remedial classes? It conveys a set of norms and values without ever writing it down that this is what we believe. The null curriculum consists of what is not taught at all. And I'll give an example. When I was in high school in the 1970s, one of my classes was driver's education. I had driver's education, fourth period every day. That was at the time a part of the curriculum. Driver's education is rarely taught anymore within the school setting. Usually it is an extracurricular, a planned experience outside of the regular education that is happening. And that extracurricular activities that also include things like sports, before school, after school, all of those things relate to the curriculum that are taught. I'm going to offer that we have a lot of cleanup to do when it comes to curriculum. One of the major findings that is troubling is the lack of consistency and coherence when it comes to the curriculum that's taught. RAND study that actually was conducted before the pandemic. It was published in 2020, but it was actually conducted before the pandemic, found that almost 90% of public school teachers added, mixed, and matched a plethora of content from the internet into their district mandated content, with Teachers Pay Teachers being the most consulted source. What that ends up creating are a whole lot of people who have to be curriculum DJs. In other words, they're trying to put together their own curriculum. And I'm just going to say this right now. We are not experts at a scope and sequence. We are not experts at that. And when we begin to mix and match what those curricular materials are with abandon, it undermines perhaps what the linear progression is supposed to be. Now, I in no way am suggesting that we must adhere tightly and closely, no matter what, to the published curriculum. But we need to be very thoughtful about how it is that we change that curriculum. We're not doing it just because we found something cute on the internet, and so we're going to teach this and we're not going to teach that, but rather that we're doing it with thought. We're doing it with our students in mind. Another contributor to this idea of mixing and matching includes what had been some of the more common messaging that had been done a decade or two ago around this idea of priority standards. Now, importantly as well, these priority standards, the conversations happened before there were lots of standard reforms that were happening. And here's one quote: that priority standards are a carefully selected subset of the total list of grade-specific and course-specific standards within each content area that students must know and be able to do by the end of the school year in order to be prepared for the standards at the next grade level or course. What that has gotten misinterpreted as is, let's just choose certain standards that we're going to teach, and we're going to disregard the others. In other words, that there are standards that become part of the null curriculum. That was not what the original messaging was. The original messaging was, let's pay some really close attention to these particular standards as markers of our progress. However, as I said, it sometimes has gotten misinterpreted as these are the only standards that are important, and we don't need to pay any more attention to them. The conversation around priority standards kind of died down a bit, especially as there were a variety of standards reforms that were happening. However, it kind of reared its ugly head again during COVID. And there were efforts around identifying what priority standards were. I was a part of that effort here in California. And so I want to be able to shape that very much so. When we did the work on priority standards, it was when we were in full lockdown. The state had suspended, had put a moratorium on any kind of state testing. School days online were limited. If you're in California, you remember that we had 4 hours a day. We had 4 hours to be able to teach. And so there needed to be some necessary compression. And so priority standards were identified. The moratorium around testing was lifted. The temporary nature of priority standards was lifted. And yet, even now, and I can tell you a couple of weeks ago, I talked to a principal who was still focused on the priority standards. And there is no state, there is no province who is going to say to a school or to a district, hey, we'll only test you on whatever you decided the priority standards are. That model has been utilized and has been perpetuated in some professional learning communities. That priority standards should meet the following selection criteria around endurance, for example, around leverage, around readiness. And even with a protocol, and I'd want to draw your attention to the very first sentence that's in there. Collaborative teams use these criteria to identify 7 to 12, or approximately 1/3 of the state standards per subject or per grade level. What terrible messaging. What a disservice to teachers. What a disservice to students. Because the misinterpretation of that is we're only going to spend time teaching 1/3 of the standards. And what that ends up resulting in is differential impact. There are some students who are not going to be as impacted by those decisions. And we know that there are lots of students who are going to be negatively impacted. So let's follow this over the course of 3 years. And for those of you that are fans of TNTP and the work that they have done, the research that we have done, here's the opportunity myth in play. So let's say that a team, a school, a district decides we're only going to teach some of the standards. That means that there are some standards that are not taught. And then those students go from 6th grade to 7th grade, and that model is still in existence. Only now, what is underneath the surface, the iceberg problem, the null curriculum, is that there are even more standards that have not been taught. And then they go on to 8th grade. And now they have this huge deficit. It is really hard to get good at what you have not been taught. So we have to be able to change that dynamic, change that conversation. One of the ways, and this is another one of the protocols that we have featured, is to use what's called a table of specifications. In other words, to make sure that at the unit level that we make some decisions about what is going to be taught, and at the same time, we make some initial decisions about what is going to be assessed. There's lots of evidence that in teacher-created assessments in particular, that what's on the assessment at the end of the unit is more reflective of what was taught as opposed to what the standards were. What teachers believe the students can be successful in versus what the entire contents of that are. So I'm going to show you some table of specifications, and then a little bit later on, I'm going to show you a way to be able to do it. So don't get intimidated by how seemingly complex this is. Table of specifications is something that psychometricians use to be able to develop those big assessments, those state and province based assessments that are going on. And Tom Guskey took that idea and said, couldn't we use this as teachers? And so he laid out a map that he called a table of specifications. Over there on the first 4 columns, and for those of you that hang around with the teacher clarity work, in particular, these are the nouns that are in the standards. This is the content of what are in the standards, especially as it relates to terminology, to facts, rules and principles, processes and procedures. On the other hand, the final 3 columns are the verbs. Those are the skills. And I'll draw your attention to that bottom row that's there in those last 3 columns. Identify, describe, use, illustrate, compare, contrast. Those are the skills. The nouns are on one side, the skills are on the other. And what Gusky talked about is, what if we take a unit that we're planning on doing, a unit of instruction, and we figure out from the standards that are going to be featured in that particular unit how all of these line up. So I'll show you a couple of different examples. Here's one from eighth grade English, and this particular unit, the teachers were teaching about character analysis, being able to identify direct and indirect characterizations, and so on. And so you'll see over in those first 4 columns, vocabulary, specific information, rules and principles, processes and procedures. That's all content related. And then the skills over on the left or on the right-hand side, being able to identify the protagonist and the antagonist, using evidence from the text to be able to support indirect and direct characterizations, evaluating the development of the protagonist and the antagonist. In other words, those final 3 columns become your assessment map. They become your plan about what it is that you want students to be able to accomplish when you assess them. I'll show you a couple of other examples. Same kind of a map. In this particular case is a 5th grade social studies unit from some teachers in Maryland. And I'll draw your attention to the final 3 columns. This tells you what it is that you want featured on your assessment. And Ashley, I absolutely agree with you. It's important to be able to test out their factual knowledge, their knowledge of the terminology, but utilizing those final 3 columns helps you to understand, hey, these are things that I want to feature on our end of unit test. And here's one for kindergarten. This is kindergarten, a unit about insects. Now, I promise that at the end of our time together, when we get to AI, I'm going to show you how it is that you can do this. Because it seems kind of daunting. But with AI invited to the table, can really be helpful. And so how do I engage in those conversations about teaching and learning, right? Another method and another protocol that we have featured is around assignment analysis, looking at the tasks that students are doing in particular. Super important to be able to analyze what those tasks are. The assignment analysis protocol that we have was developed by Education Trust and is a phenomenal method to be able to look at what are the tasks that we want our students to do during that unit of instruction, so that we can not only advance learning, but we can also gauge, monitor what kind of progress they're making before they get to the end of the unit. One of the items that is featured in there are around instructional strategies that are associated at the surface level, the deep level, and the transfer levels of learning. These are, and this all comes from John Hattie's visible learning work. The effect sizes are over there in the 2nd column and the 4th column. And I just want to point out that when we're talking about surface level acquisition of knowledge, which is super important at the beginning of a unit, not surprisingly, you're doing a lot more in terms of like vocabulary instruction, direct instruction. We're doing some wide reading, those sorts of things that are happening. In other words, it's very teacher-directed instruction that's happening. But now compare what that looks like when we want to deepen students' learning, how the instructional strategies change. It's no longer as teacher-directed. Now we're looking at students being able to assume some of that cognitive and metacognitive responsibility. In other words, teaching surface level acquisition and consolidation instruction all across a unit is not going to get you to deep levels of learning. They need opportunities for classroom instruction. They need opportunities to be able to reflect and make judgments on their own learning. They need to engage in study skills. Remember that study skills are not just things that happen outside of class. They need to be able to engage in lots of collaborative learning. And then let's take that a step further to transfer of learning. And transfer of learning is actually what is manifested on those big assessments, those state assessments. Can you use this information in new and novel ways? Look at what students have to do in order to be able to move to transfer of learning. Peer tutoring and peer learning that's going on. Synthesizing information across text, not just within a text. Extended writing. Formal discussions like Socratic seminars and debates. There are big differences in how it is that we move the learning forward. However, if we're only sticking with that surface level learning of acquisition and consolidation of facts, we'll never get to those deeper levels of learning. Teachers deserve to be able to know this, to be able to look at how it is that they're pairing up instruction with curriculum and with assessment, the table of specifications being one example, in order to be able to stabilize that stool. So let's talk about that final aspect, using AI as a teaching assistant. And this is certainly something that has now become available that we didn't even dream of whenever we worked on the first edition. How do we bring AI into the conversation? For AI to be a thought partner. One of the most valuable pieces of advice that I got from a colleague at the university who is on our university's committee for artificial intelligence at San Diego State. And he said, you know, the secret is really this: treat AI like an intern. Let AI do the first initial lift so that teachers can actually do what they do best, which is to use their wisdom, use their expertise to be able to refine, to be able to revise, rather than starting with a blank page. How frustrating is it for so many PLC teams to have to start with a blank screen? What are we going to write? What are we going to be able to do? Let's have AI in there to be able to help us out, to be another part of our team as well. In fact, Doug and I, along with our co-author Megan Hargrave, recently wrote an article about bringing artificial intelligence to the PLC table. And there is a link there if you are interested in being able to find that. But what that can look like in particular is that you can use AI right there in the meeting to be able to have those conversations, to be able to use that AI, that chatbot, as a thought partner that you're inviting right into the table, that you can collaborate with. There's so much wisdom, there's so much human wisdom and expertise that's at the table. Let AI do some of the legwork for you. So one of the features that we have now is that peppered throughout all of the modules are places that you might consider asking a bot. And what we've done is we've done some prompt engineering for you in order to be able to kind of shape what it is that you might ask. For example, this might be a first pass at getting AI to be able to develop that table of specifications for you. Uploading a model of what it is that looks like. Here are the standards that you're going to be working on. Let it know what the categories are that you're looking for. And now you go back and forth with the chatbot to be able to revise and refine what that looks like. What a great way to be able to use the expertise that's right there at the table, the human expertise. Another example is in having chatbots begin to be able to draft lesson plans. However, I will say this too, they need parameters. In fact, that some of the more recent evidence is that without parameters, that the lesson plans that are generated by the chatbot tend to be very teacher directed. In other words, and hopefully what that's sparking up for you is, oh, it's going to be really hard to be able to get them to deeper levels of learning if we're only doing teacher directed instruction. That's happening. What you'll find in the book as well are some evidence around Rosenshine's components. You can grab those, copy those and grab those, or perhaps you're a 5E district, perhaps you use gradual release of responsibility as your instructional framework. Whatever your framework is, let the chatbot know what it is that you're looking for. Here's one more example. Since we talked about assessment and curriculum and instruction, here's one more example. Chatbots can create assessments quickly, but again, without the parameters, most of those items are going to be kind of literal and limited to that surface level of learning. Again, we've created a potential prompt that you can use to be able to define more completely what it is that you're looking for in that assessment. So lots of ideas to be able to do so. We want to make sure that we're getting it right when it comes to professional learning communities. Educators deserve to have the kind of professional learning community experiences that are enriching, that build their collective efficacy, that allow them to be able to line up the high expectations that they have for their students with the instruction that goes along with that. And so with that, I hope that you're walking away with a couple of ideas. These were our 4 success criteria for today. So I hope you're feeling a bit of success in being able to do so. And with that, I want to turn this over to Megan in particular, because I know that you're going to have a giveaway, and I am going to put in one more plug. We'll be in New Orleans. We're going to be down south. I'm looking so forward to it in November for our PLC Plus conference, our annual PLC Plus conference that we have every year. We'd love to see you there. And so with that, Megan, who are our winners?
All right. Well, thank you. First of all, I want to just say thank you so much, Nancy, for letting us learn with you today. I hope you can see all of the emojis and the hearts and the little hands on your screen, because I think everyone here has come away with some new ideas just based on the comments in the chat. I think there have been some real aha moments and a lot of takeaways they can use, especially with AI. So thank you for joining us today, Nancy.
Thank you. Thank you.
Bye-bye.